start recording. Okay, so attendees are coming in. Okay, 72 attendees.
Are we ready?
Ready to go.
Carla?
Yep, I think so. Attendees are slowly starting to come in. So far we have 93. And so, yeah, I think we're good to go.
Okay.
Unless we want to wait maybe 1 or 2 more minutes.
Will you tell me when to start?
Sure.
Deal.
And Rachel, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Excellent.
And then as attendees go ahead and join in, they'll just listen in.
Great. Thank you, Carla. So I want to welcome everyone to our first workshop webinar of our October Virtual Domestic Violence Conference. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel McKenzie. I am the chair of this year's conference, and it's my honor to introduce our first presenters and their workshop, Race and the Prosecution of Domestic Violence, which I'm sure is going to be fantastic. We're joined by both James Gibbons Shapiro and Honey Tran of the Santa Clara County Office of the District Attorney. James has been there for 23 years, and he's prosecuted every kind of case from murder to misappropriation of public funds. Currently, he's one of the 6 assistant DAs that manages the trial and other teams in the DA's office. He's a pretty busy guy. He supervises the family violence team, the criminal strategies unit, the victim services unit, the high-tech crimes team, and the regional auto theft task force prosecutors. He chairs the county's domestic violence death review team and also chairs the annual effort to update and revise the county's domestic violence protocol for law enforcement, which is a huge task. And since its first publication 4 years ago, he has led the effort to gather, analyze, and publish the DA office's race and prosecution report. Thanks for joining us, James. We also have Honey Tran, and she currently serves as a deputy district attorney, and she, also being a community-based prosecutor, focuses on crime prevention initiatives serving the Vietnamese community. Honey joined the district attorney's office in 2012, where she has worked on numerous teams, including the Family Violence Unit, Major Narcotics Vendor Prosecution Unit, and the Community Prosecution Unit. She's been the recipient of Aki's Gordon N. Chan Leadership Award in 2020, as well as the SJPD's George W. Kennedy Excellence in Prosecution Award in 2017. And it is my honor to turn the floor over to both of them. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a hot, smoky Friday afternoon, so I really appreciate everybody to come have this important conversation with us. The theme for this year's conference is Hidden Bruises. And what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is a topic that I think has been hiding in plain sight for those of us all of us who work in intimate partner violence fields. And what I mean by that is that the racial disproportionality in the criminal justice system, and by disproportionality, I mean the difference between the mixture of the racial or ethnic groups that are the defendants in criminal cases and that mixture in our community. And it's hiding because we rarely talk about it. And even when we talk about race in the criminal justice system in general, we rarely talk about race in intimate partner violence. And it's in plain sight because even though we don't talk about those disproportionalities, that we see them and we feel them. We see them in the courtrooms that we're in. We see them in the lobbies of the emergency room and in the waiting rooms at victim advocacy nonprofits. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about are things that we know a little bit about, we can feel about, we have experiences with, but what we're going to do today is put some actual numbers behind that feeling to really talk about what is the disproportionality in our community. And we're going to talk a little bit about the efforts that Hani is making and that we're trying to make more broadly to address that disproportionality. So I'm going to talk in the first half, and then Hani is going to talk in the second half, and then we'll open it up to your questions. I'm going to share my screen now and talk a little bit about some of these numbers. So let's go there, share. All right. Hani, can you see my screen? Okay, good. All right. Well, let's talk first about the overall situation in Santa Clara County. What's the racial and ethnic mix? So this is a chart that shows the census data from our community, our county, and it roughly shows that the county is about a third white or Caucasian. It's about a third Asian or Pacific Islander. It's about a third Hispanic, Latino, a little bit less than that. It's about 3% African American, and there's other categories in that as well. So that's the overall mix of the race of Santa Clara County. I want to talk about some of the things that are also true about different racial and ethnic groups in Santa Clara County. One is that there are huge disparities in the median household income in these different racial or ethnic groups. So you can see that the median household income for Latino families and African American families is dramatically lower than the median household income in our county for Asian families or for white or Caucasian families. Now, that's not to say that on a nationwide basis, those median household incomes aren't very high. I think many communities across the country would be very happy if the median household income in their community was $78,000 or $84,000. But I put this up here to really show that stark disparity between the median household income. And that's not the only place where we see disparities. The next chart I'm going to put up is about high school non-completion or high school dropout rates. And this is for our county from 2016-2017. And you can see that the dropout rates are highest for our Hispanic Latino families, for our African American and Black families. This is trying to give a little bit of a historical perspective to our county's racial history. This is a 1937 redlining map for San Jose. So redlining, we could have a whole talk about redlining, but what I want to say here is that the federal government and the banks designated different parts of cities and communities all across the country as places where loans would be given on good terms or loans would be given on bad terms. And places in red were places in San Jose in 1937 where loans were not being given on good terms. And there were, when you also mixed that with the prohibitions that were in deeds in Santa Clara County up until the 1940s that prohibited the sale in different neighborhoods to non-white families. You started in the early part of the 20th century with segregation of the way the city was being built and the way the city was being developed. And that has echoes to today. So this next map, so the circle is a portion of the redlining map, which was red in 1937. And in 2018, that circle was a hotspot for where juvenile felonies were being committed in Santa Clara County. It's also a hotspot for gun crimes in 2018. I had one for gang density. Oh, there it is. Well, I'm kind of messing it up a little bit, but that was trying to show you that it's also a hotspot for gang crime density in 2018. So those historical racist policies that were in other communities across the United States were also in effect in Santa Clara County, were also in effect in San Jose, and also have reverberations through to today. So I think that's an important background for the next part of what I'm going to talk about, which is some of the other effects that we've seen in different communities. So the 95112 area is the area that is part of that circle and part of the 95122 area. And you can see that that same area where there was redlining in the 1930s and where there was housing discrimination up until the 1940s also has higher incidence than other parts of the county of families with children living below the poverty line, and also of other indicators of challenges in the community, including perceptions of danger of crime. All right, so this next chart is showing what is the disproportionality in the criminal justice system. So take a look, for example, at the Latino part of the bar graph. So it's showing that more than 50% of the cases that the DA's office prosecuted in 2019 had Hispanic or Latino defendants, even though 26% of the population in Santa Clara County is Hispanic or Latino. And you see that disproportionality also very high in our African American community, 3 times or more the representation amongst the population of criminal defendants compared to the population of African Americans in our community, and dramatically disproportionately low for our Asian communities. One of the things that I want to talk about is how the DA's office makes decisions. So we receive police reports from investigations from police agencies. Either someone's been arrested or the police have figured out who committed a crime. We receive those reports and then we make a decision about whether criminal charges are going to be filed in that case. And this next chart is showing the percentage of those decisions that we make by race and ethnicity in 2018. And you can see that while there are disproportionalities, it's not the exact same number for all racial and ethnic groups. It's what's striking to me is how dramatically similar it is, what the filing rate is, what the rate is, and where the DA's office is filing criminal charges. It's about 80% for all racial and ethnic groups. And going back to this chart that shows those stark disproportionalities, it's showing that while there's an effect of the DA's office in making those filing decisions, there's more going on here, more about who's being arrested, who's being investigated, perhaps who's calling 911 as well. And I want to talk about that as we go a little bit further in this. So I want to talk about some other crimes as well to give a context for the racial disproportionality, and really to show you how similar it is across really dissimilar crime types. So there's been a lot of discussion, especially in the last few months, about crimes of resisting arrest, the crime of resisting or delaying a police officer. And you can see that the disproportionalities that we saw for all criminal cases, felonies, and misdemeanors are also true, a little bit different, but also true for this category of case of resisting arrest. So resisting arrest is happening face-to-face with a police officer. You're also seeing those disproportionalities in driving under the influence of alcohol. These are cases that start with a traffic stop by a police officer. I'm just going to pause for a second so you can think about those for a minute. And I'm going to go to residential burglaries. So residential burglaries are solved by police officers after an investigation. So the police are not present when a residential burglary is happening. Someone has called the police, they've investigated it, and they've figured out after lifting fingerprints or looking at surveillance video or in some other way who was the person who committed that burglary on a house. And then this disproportionality, again, it's not the same, but it has remarkably similar numbers to the overall numbers. Let's talk about white collar crime. These kinds of crimes really are the exception to the disproportionality that we've seen in other kinds of cases. You still see disproportionality here, but it is much less than you see in the other kinds of cases that we've talked about so far. And again, white collar crime is solved not in a direct face-to-face contact with a police officer. It's not solved in a traffic stop. It's not. It's solved much more similarly to the way a residential burglary is solved. When we look at our victims of crime, so these are numbers for our victim services unit at the DA's office. And not all victims, about 25 to 30% of victims decline to state what their race is. But if you look at the race of people who did not decline to state what their race is at intake with DA Victim Services, you can see that we're also showing disproportionalities that are similar to the disproportionalities in the community of people, the groups of people that we prosecute for crimes, that they're not the same, but they're very similar. And again, this is people who are being served by DA Victim Services who've chosen to state a race at an intake interview, and those are primarily people who are victims of violent crimes, including domestic violence. All right, so let's talk about domestic violence. The next set that I'm going to talk about are all about domestic violence in particular. And so this is domestic violence battery. For those of you who are police officers or lawyers or judges, it's a 243E misdemeanor. You can see that the kinds of disproportionalities that we've been talking about for the criminal justice system as a whole are also true for 243Es. Higher for the Hispanic and Latino defendants, higher for the African American defendants, dramatically lower for the Asian Pacific Islander defendants, lower but not as dramatically lower for white or Caucasian. Let's look at the more serious charges of domestic violence. This is where there's evidence of an injury that's been filed by the DA's office. And those have a very similar kind of disproportionality. And I just want to pause on this for a moment, because these kinds of crimes are primarily driven by 911 calls. So that the police are responding to a 911 call and they're either solving the case there and arresting someone. And we have a part of our law enforcement guide for domestic violence that asks the officers to identify who's the dominant aggressor and to arrest that person. So some people refer to that as a pro-arrest policy. It's definitely an identification of the dominant aggressor policy. And where the person is not there, perhaps the perpetrator has fled, the police are, if they've figured out who that is or the victim has told them who that is, that we're filing those cases too. But again, they're started by a 911 call. And these disproportionalities that we've seen in other categories of the criminal justice system are holding true also in domestic violence that are solved by the police in very different ways. I broke out the Asian population in this chart more particularly than lumping all Asian groups together. And these are Asian designations that are taken at booking at the county jail or were designated by the suspect in the police investigation. So these are primarily self-designations by the suspects. And for the Asian populations, you can see that for our defendants, it's a real mixture of different groups who are a part of the defendants for Asian defendants. But the overall disproportionalities, when you look at all domestic violence charges, felonies, misdemeanors, and violations of restraining order primarily, this is what we're seeing. And I want you to compare this for a second to the next chart, which is domestic violence victims, all charges, again, broken down by victim. And one of the things to note is the difference in the number that we saw for Vietnamese victims. We're seeing a higher number of Vietnamese victims than in the previous slide. But overall, the numbers are holding very similar. And that's something to note as we go forward to some of the other slides I'm going to talk about, because this next one is about restraining orders. And this is the race of the defendant, where the violation of the restraining order that was charged by the DA's office was a criminal court restraining order, and violations of the restraining order was a family court restraining order. And one of the things that we see is there's a real difference in the Vietnamese community in violations of family court restraining orders. And that, I think, is a part of what I think Hani is going to talk about a little bit, is different kinds of access to family court and different kinds of resources in family court. All right, so this next slide, this is a complicated slide. I'm not going to tell you all the parts about it. It's basically domestic violence deaths everywhere in the county, and it shows that we have domestic violence deaths everywhere in the county. And this death numbers we've studied on Domestic Violence Death Review. And one of the things that's striking when we looked at the race of perpetrators in domestic violence deaths, that the disproportionality, it doesn't disappear, but it's dramatically reduced. The race of the perpetrator looks much more like the racial breakdown of our community when we look at cases that are domestic violence deaths. And that's true when we look at the victims as well, that the disproportionality that we saw in filed criminal cases is much less apparent in this death review data. And I think that that shows something important. One of the things that I think it shows is that, well, there's a couple conclusions you could draw from this. One conclusion you could draw from this is that the dramatic disproportionality low that we're seeing in filed domestic violence cases where the victim is Asian, that largely disappears in this death review data, that's because in our Asian communities that we have perpetrators who do not do any acts of domestic violence until they kill their victim. That's one conclusion you could draw. I think a more reasonable conclusion to draw is that we have a dramatic underreporting in this already across the board underreported crime, but a dramatic underreporting in our Asian communities of domestic violence. And it's part of a broader picture, but now that we're focusing in on domestic violence, I think that's something that we can have as a working assumption really from looking at these different kinds of data together. I want to talk a little bit about how we in the DA's office have thought about and tried to address disproportionality before I turn it over to Hani to talk about efforts specifically in the Vietnamese community. And one of the things that has been the case under DA Jeff Rosen is that there's been a variety of reforms in different categories of the criminal justice system that have had disproportionate effects because the overall criminal justice system has more Latino defendants than their representation in the community, more African-American defendants than their representation in the community. So this is one example of that. In 2019, DA Rosen announced a new policy for our county that said for low-level narcotic crimes, where previously we would file a criminal case, the case would be sent to drug court, the drug court judge would refer that person to drug counseling, drug programming, and that if successfully completed, it would be, that would result in the dismissal or termination of the prosecution against that person, really putting the court in the center of those cases in referring and monitoring drug treatment programs. And this new reform that started last year said, well, let's take, if the goal for these low-level drug offenses is treatment, let's take the courts out of being the middleman for that treatment. Why don't we, for these low-level crimes, unless someone gets 3 of them in a calendar year, not file a criminal case at all, and instead directly refer those cases to drug treatment and not have the criminal judge be the middleman in drug treatment where the goal is at the end of that not to have any criminal prosecution. So it's hard to say what all the long-term or even medium-term effects of that policy are going to be, but here's a real short-term effect. Last year, in the last 5 months of 2019, which was when the policy was enacted, 3,583 people did not have criminal charges filed against them for low-level drug offenses that otherwise would have, and that had a disproportionate effect on especially Latino defendants, African-American defendants, because when the pie itself is disproportionate and you shrink the pie, you have greater effects in communities that are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. So a lot of the things that, that's one example that I could give you, but a lot of the things that have been done in criminal justice reform across the country and in our county have been this idea that I've been talking about, or that I just mentioned, of shrinking the pie and having disproportionate effects as a result. But what I want to talk about next, or rather what I'm going to invite Hani Tran to talk about next, is another way to think about this disproportionality and to try to address the issue that I just talked about, which is a conclusion you can draw from the looking at the domestic violence death review data and the data for filed criminal cases with a live victim, and say, what can be done, and is there more that can be done to increase the engagement in our Asian communities for reporting and services for domestic violence. And I'm sure many of you know that the Vietnamese population in Santa Clara County is the second largest Vietnamese population in the world outside of Vietnam. We're going to get to your questions in about half an hour, 35 minutes or so, but I'm going to turn it over to Hani Tran to talk about her work specifically in the Vietnamese community.
Thank you, James. Now, just give us a sec while we switch shared screen mode.
Yep.
All right. Okay. JGS, can you see that?
I just saw it. Now I can see it. Great.
Very good. Okay. So now one of the data points that James spoke about is how our office sees disproportionately fewer family violence cases involving Asian defendants and victims. We know that within our immigrant communities, there are additional barriers that make it difficult for them to report when violence occurs within the home. As James mentioned, today I'll tell you about my role as one of our office's community-based prosecutors, and specifically the work that I'm doing on behalf of our office to address domestic violence and family violence in our local Vietnamese community, both to break down the stigma around domestic violence, as well as to bridge the gap between the community and the systems in place to address domestic violence. As community prosecutors, our work primarily focuses on preventing crime from occurring. So unlike a traditional line prosecutor who handles a criminal case in court after a DV-related crime has occurred, I work further up the pipeline, hoping to reach those Vietnamese families that are suffering from family violence before they even enter the legal system. One of the barriers that makes it difficult for Vietnamese survivors to seek help and to report is the stigma against airing any fact that they think would reflect negatively on their family, as well as on the Vietnamese community. So this could include discord or disagreement or violence that occurs within our families. In 2018, I worked in partnership with ACCI, who are our lead coordinators on this project, as well as our county's Office of Women's Policy, First Five, and East San Jose Peace Partnership to develop a prevention campaign called I Dare to Air, My Resilience, My Truth. I Dare to Air is a traveling exhibit of traditional dresses from 7 different immigrant communities, including Vietnamese. The other communities were Mexican, Cambodian, South Asian, Korean, Chinese, and Filipino. On this slide, you'll see the text of the board introducing the exhibit, and it reads, domestic violence occurs across all walks of life in Santa Clara County. Within our ethnic communities and communities of color, there are additional dynamics that make it more difficult for survivors to reach out for support. In some families, the notion to not air our dirty laundry continues to reign. Without community support, survivors will continue to suffer, and the effects of abuse will ripple across multiple generations. I Dare to Air reveals the experiences of survivors from our local communities who have dared to speak out. By uplifting their struggles, we encourage the community to be more aware of the unique barriers these families face. By airing their triumphs, we support other survivors to speak their truths. Now, accompanying each one of the dresses are the real stories from a survivor from these 7 ethnic communities. And each of these stories were written in the survivor's own words, details how they lived through the abuse and ultimately sought help to break the cycle of violence. On this slide, you'll see a photo of a Vietnamese traditional dress, the Ao Dai, and the accompanying survivor story on that board. And I'll read an excerpt from her story. "I will continue to tell them my story to let them know help is available. Nowadays, I am the owner of my life. Nobody says you have to do whatever I say because you are a wife, and if you do not, you deserve to be punished. I do not have bruises anymore." Now, one of our goals was to highlight the stories of triumph from each of these communities so that survivors suffering in silence would see the prevalence of domestic violence. It happens in all ethnic communities. And we wanted them to be encouraged by other survivors who have made it out of abusive relationships so that they would be motivated to speak their own truths. And pairing these dresses with the stories was also very intentional and meaningful. We know DV is a tough topic to broach in these communities, and if it wasn't an exhibit that was overtly about DV, some people in these communities would dismiss it and walk by and not engage with the exhibit at all. But the beautiful dresses drew people to the exhibit so that they would read the stories accompanying each dress. And it's meaningful in that it's not unlike how DV and family violence manifests in some families, where on the surface, everything may seem like it's going very well. The kids may be doing really well in school and the parents may have successful careers. But when people look closer and beneath the surface, they'll see some of the pain and trauma within those families. Alongside the exhibit, we had a resource shelf that you'll see on the picture on the left side. And this shelf carried brochures of DV resources from many DV service providers in multiple languages. And of course, from the 5 primary DV service providers from our county, ACCI, Maitri, Next Door Solutions, Community Solutions, and the YWCA. We also carried brochures from our office about the Family Justice Center and First 5 about their family resource centers as well. On the lower right side of the screen, you'll see these pledge cards, these purple pledge cards that First 5 helped us create for the launch of the exhibit in October of 2018. And so with these pledge cards, people could pledge what they would personally do, what role they would play to prevent domestic violence. And so we included a hashtag with each of the pledge cards so that people engaging with the exhibit could post the photos and the pledge cards on social media along with that hashtag. You'll see on the upper right-hand corner a table with some markers. And so for some of the locations where this exhibit traveled to, we allowed the public to engage with the exhibit by writing messages of support for the survivors. And we would take photos of the messages and post them on our social media along with showing the photos of the exhibit as it traveled. Now, since the exhibit launched in 2018, it has traveled throughout our county. We invited partners serving our immigrant families to host the clothesline exhibit. On this slide, you'll see some of the school districts and schools that have hosted our exhibit. Franklin-McKinley School District, as well as Eastside Unified High School District, have both hosted the clothesline at their district office. And the exhibit is currently housed at Lerone College Prep, and it has been since early spring when shelter in place was imposed. And Lerone College Prep is a 9th to 12th grade school within Franklin-McKinley High School District. And we wanted to target these 2 school districts because they are in the east side of San Jose, and many of their students come from immigrant families, and they have a lot of Spanish-speaking families, Vietnamese-speaking families. So we wanted to target the schools and the school districts where many of our highest needs immigrant families are located. The exhibit has also traveled to community centers and family resource centers. On the left of the screen, you'll see the exhibit at the Educare Center in Santee. And that is a neighborhood in East San Jose with a high population of Spanish-speaking families. And this Family Resource Center is fantastic, and the Educare Center is fantastic because it's used quite heavily by the local families there. The neighborhood associations use the space nearby, and it's right next door to the Franklin McKinley Children's Initiative, which is a fantastic nonprofit that does a lot of work supporting families in that community. On the right side, you'll see the exhibit at the School of Arts and Culture at the Mexican Heritage Plaza in the Mayfair neighborhood in East San Jose. And community groups and dance groups rent this space for use. The exhibit has also traveled to government agencies, and we wanted to target government agencies because, you know, our personnel, like we have a diverse personnel, so we wanted to target the employees, but also because these agencies serve our immigrant families. The photo on the left you'll see is from the exhibit's launch in October 2018, and that's at our county building here at 70 West Heading, and that's when the exhibit was launched. On the far right, you'll see the exhibit at the lobby of San Jose City Hall, where the exhibit traveled to the following year for October DV Awareness Month in 2019. There was a great event hosted by Next Door Solutions and Council Member Magdalena Carrasco in the Rotunda, kicking off the DV Awareness Month, where our exhibit was displayed. And for the remainder of the month, the exhibit was housed in the lobby so that folks visiting City Hall would see the exhibit. In the middle of the page, you'll see the clothesline at one of our public health facilities on Story Road. On this page, you'll see our exhibit at some other locations with some of our other partners. The exhibit has traveled to a couple of Kaiser Permanente's offices. This photo is from their Milpitas location. It's also traveled to the Santa Clara location as well. And in this photo, you'll see our lead coordinators at ACI, Anja Chow and Veronica Jung, as well as one of the folks from our DA's office who's been helping to move the exhibit. On the right, you'll see that the exhibit traveled to Bank of America. Two of their locations house our exhibit, one in Palo Alto and one here in San Jose. And then in the middle of the page, the exhibit is in the lobby of ACI's Moore Park location. And essentially, it kind of came home since ACI was the lead coordinators for the case. But of course, at the Moore Park location, ACI has a health center, has many great wellness and health programs for the community. And so the exhibit was able to reach those families and ACI's clients that use the space. We wanted to be sure that our traveling clothesline had an online presence so that we could outreach to folks who use social media. And so the exhibit would reach far and wide. You can learn out more about the exhibit at ACI's website listed here. And at that link, you'll see the handwritten stories from our survivors. ACI was amazing in leading this initiative, and they collected the stories from the survivors that they've supported, as well as partnered with Maitri and Community Solutions to collect stories of survivors that those organizations had supported as well. Okay, and this hashtag, you can go on Facebook, hashtag I Dare to Dare DV Awareness, and type that in, and you'll be able to follow the exhibit as it travels to different locations. And again, right now it's housed at Lerone College Prep, and we hope that it'll move again once shelter in place is lifted. And so if part of an agency or an organization that's interested in housing this exhibit, once it's safe to move the exhibit, please reach out to me and let me know. We would love to partner with you. And down below, we have the logos of all the agencies that work together and collaborated on this wonderful prevention campaign. So pivoting from our traveling exhibit and social media and hashtags, we also sought to outreach to first generation and the older Vietnamese population who rely on Vietnamese radio for local news and information. My parents, when I was growing up, listened to the Vietnamese radio every day. We've done outreach on 1500 AM KSJX, Vietnam Bắc Cali, and it's a Vietnamese, the Vietnamese Northern California radio station. According to the host, Ms. Hat Vang, who's the woman in the back, the station reaches more than 150,000 Vietnamese listeners in the counties of Santa Clara, Alameda, as well as parts of San Mateo and Santa Cruz. And we got involved in this because we were invited by Vang Lang Jung, and that's the woman on the right. She is a Vietnamese community leader, and she currently works for our county's behavioral health department, but she's done so many great things and been a public servant for a long time. But she, on behalf of our county, is doing some outreach for our county to let the Vietnamese community know about the progress of the construction of the Vietnamese American Service Center that the county is constructing on Center Road in the heart of Little Saigon. And the county hopes that this will be a one-stop shop essentially for the community to access health services and social services in the community. And so she would periodically go on the radio station to update the community about the progress of its building. And one thing she did was invited different county agencies, including the DA's office, on so that we could share with the community what we do. And again, it's just to make the community more familiar with us. And again, it's to break down that barrier, right? And so we came on, and I came on probably 5 or 6 times to talk about different crime prevention topics, fraud, real estate scams, things like that that would benefit the community. But one of the shows we did was on family violence. And we invited a DA from the family violence team, Victoria Robinson, to come on to the show with us to talk about DV. And we used a prominent DV case involving a Vietnamese defendant and victim, a case that was prosecuted by our office. And we also talked about some general case examples of elder abuse and child abuse that we see in all communities, including the Vietnamese communities. And we use these cases as a jumping off point to discuss the themes of cycle of violence and our office's emphasis on protecting the safety of vulnerable victims, as well as on rehabilitation and treatment when it's appropriate. We also talked about resources available from our offices, including the Family Justice Center, particularly the one at the Aki location in Story Road in Little Saigon, where the community could come to access, to speak with a family law attorney, to speak with a victim advocate, things like that. All right. So another way that we've done outreach is by attending Vietnamese community events. At some events, I specifically speak to the community about the role of our office in prosecuting family violence cases and explain what happens when the case, with the case as it proceeds through the legal system. We also table at large Vietnamese community events where agencies are invited to interact with the community and to hand out brochures. Some of the brochures we hand out related to TV are on this PowerPoint. We have Vietnamese language brochures and English ones that I usually bring to these types of events. And so the ones that I have on here is the one about our Family Justice Center, our Victim Services Unit, and about DV safety planning. I also bring partner brochures as well. By that I mean, I interact with like Aki or another nonprofit like ICANN, a Vietnamese nonprofit that does great work for the community. And I collect brochures from them, and I always bring them along as well, so that I can help disseminate and distribute in the event that those brochures are helpful for the community. So next I'll talk about a sampling of events that I've been invited to. So on this slide, I participated in ICANN's forum. And ICANN, like I mentioned, is a fantastic Vietnamese nonprofit dedicated to serving our local Vietnamese community. And ICANN was having these ongoing conversations with the community about how to build healthy relationships, how to recognize domestic violence, and the role that the different agencies play in supporting families. The panelists at this particular event were all Vietnamese-speaking women, and so In addition to me as a DA from our office, we had Sergeant Samantha Huyn, who is a sergeant with, at the time, with a family violence unit at San Jose PD, as well as a social worker from DFCS. And then Miss Iris Din, who is a mental health therapist, and she is the facilitator of ICANN's Women's Support Group, and I'll talk more a bit about that later on. This event was held at the Vietnamese American Cultural Center in East San Jose, right across from YB High School. And that's one event that we participated in. We've also tabled at an adult education center called the Overfelt Adult Center. Twice a year, they have these great information fairs where they invite agencies to come and bring information that they think would be helpful for their students. And many of their students are English learners and they're immigrants. And they have these events because they are trying to encourage their students or to give an opportunity to their students to practice their English. But they also want these students to interact with agencies that might have useful information for them. So for me, when I tabled, I brought brochures on crime prevention, on fraud, scams targeting immigrants. And of course, I brought the DV brochures as well, in English and Spanish. So that was a great event that we participated in. And then of course, Vietnamese That Lunar New Year events, their annual New Year events in the early spring, usually at the end of January or February, depending on the year. On the upper right-hand photo, you see our office tabling at the Lunar New Year event at East Ridge Mall in 2018. And right below that, our office tabled at the event in 2019 at the Vietnamese American Cultural Center. I also participate in the Peace Partnership, which convenes organizations from different sectors to work alongside community members to address violence and to build a healthier East San Jose. The East San Jose Peace Partnership has numerous work groups to address the root causes of violence and trauma in East San Jose. And one of the work groups that I participate in on behalf of the DA's office is the Promotores to Prevent Intimate Partner Violence Work Group. Now, our primary initiative is to recruit and train resident leaders called peacemakers who become ambassadors for safe relationships in their own communities to raise awareness about DV and IPV, promote safe relationships, and connect their communities with relevant resources. And through the Peace Partnership, I am supporting and partnering with ACI and ICANN, the nonprofit that I just mentioned, to spin up and implement a culturally specific model for Asian and Vietnamese families. So at the moment, we are learning from our partners from two well-known DV service providers here in Santa Clara County, our partners at Nextdoor Solutions and Community Solutions. And their agencies have developed a Promotores program from survivors of DV that they've supported. And I know Erica Villa from Nextdoor Solutions is going to speak at a webinar coming up about that. And I just want to highlight the pledge card that you see from the on the bottom that we incorporated into our I Dare to Air prevention campaign, right? And so pledging to be a peacemaker is referring to be this community leader, this community ambassador for peace in their own community, right? And our hope is that as this exhibit travels throughout the community, and once we've built up this Promotores program, right, that, you know, the exhibit itself will raise awareness about this Peacemaker Ambassador program. And then people could, hopefully we can link to more information about the program for folks who are interested to sign up. But the hope is that we would rally people in the community to sign up and be peacemakers in their own communities. So the bulk of my work lies in prevention. But I also work to support DV service providers that do intervention work with the Vietnamese community. One agency I partner with and support is ICANN. And like I mentioned, they do a lot of great programming to support healthy outcomes for Vietnamese families and their children. One of their programs is a Vietnamese women's support group. And you'll see the flyer for the support group right there in the middle. With a picture of their facilitator, Iris Din. She's a mental health therapist, as I mentioned earlier, and she does an amazing job to help these women connect and address issues related to stress, relationships, parenting, and marriage. And they invite people to sit in on the support group periodically. And I was invited to one of their sessions to provide general information about how our legal system responds to DV cases when the police are called, about restraining orders, about how to access the self-help restraining order center, and so forth. I'm also part of an organization called BAPW, and that stands for the Vietnamese American Professional Women's Association of Silicon Valley. We're professional women, and in our group we have folks who are managers in tech companies, lawyers, doctors, business women. But we're dedicated to helping our young folks enter professional careers, and we're also dedicated to community service, right? And so I connected BAPW with ICANN so that some of our BAPW members could attend and support these women. And the goal is to show these women that they have the support of the broader community from agencies, when I'm wearing my DA hat, right? From agencies like the DA's office, but also from other Vietnamese American women in their community, as the women in these groups are seeking to build healthier lives. And I do want to plug the support group. So if in your work you know of any Vietnamese women who would benefit from this group, please go online to ICANN's webpage and do refer them to the support group. They still are meeting virtually weekly, as I understand it, and it's just for me sitting in on it that one time to have the opportunity to do so. It's very inspiring to be a part of the journey that these women are on, and I think it's a fantastic group. So one other thing I did to support ICANN was to provide trainings for their staff. They have staff and other programming serving Vietnamese families, and sometimes their clients would collaterally report DV. So I provided a training for their staff so they know about the legal process, what happens when you call the police, and how a case proceeds to court, as well as resources that they could refer their clients to. One thing that the ICANN staff mentioned, and JJS referred to this earlier when he spoke, was that some of their clients had mentioned that they, when they were trying to break out of like a DV sort of marriage that where they were being battered by their spouses, that they had a hard time filing for divorce because they didn't have access to Vietnamese language forms on the family court page, right? And so when I went on and I searched, I only saw, I didn't see Vietnamese language forms, but we were able to reach out to our Office of Cultural Competency, and they reached out to the state judicial sort of administrative folks who were in charge of some of the forms that were on the state judicial website, and they shared a hidden link with us that had these forms in Vietnamese and many other languages as well. So we were able to share that with ICANN and these women. But again, it's the difficulty for some of these survivors to access these resources and these tools because it's not in the language that's easy for them to navigate. So for us, it's making that connection for them when we can. And of course, supporting ACCI. And we know ACCI, they're a great nonprofit that does a lot of great work, and they provide a lot of health and wellness services to our underserved community, including their DV program and running the Asian Women's Home. Every year they have a holiday toy and fundraising drive for the Asian Women's Home survivors and their children. And through VAPW, the Vietnamese American Professional Women's Group that I mentioned, we have our annual holiday event, and we incorporate ACCI's holiday drive into it so that our members could show up, support, donate, and write messages of support that could be passed along to these women. Okay, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, partnering with ACCI on the I Dare to Air prevention campaign. That tip of the spear in that inverted triangle that I had at the beginning of the slides, beneath prevention and intervention is enforcement initiatives. And that is traditionally when the police or the DA is involved. And the prosecutors in our office's Family Violence Unit handle the filing and prosecution in court of those cases that come to our office. And that's the traditional role of prosecutors that you often hear about and know about. But for me as a community prosecutor, I liaise with our local police department in other ways outside of the traditional prosecution of cases. One thing I do is I partner with their crime prevention unit, and they do a lot of presentations in the community, in schools, with neighborhood associations, and with businesses. And I keep their team updated on DV resources, specifically for the Vietnamese community. And they incorporate this information into their presentations where it's appropriate. So for example, they do a really great one on personal and business safety for employees at like small mom and pop shops. And the one that I went to with one of their specialists was at a nail salon for Vietnamese employees. And so they were able to incorporate some of the resources I mentioned, including the Family Justice Center, into one of their slides so that, you know, these employees and these women, as they're listening to this information, they could see these resources in case it's relevant for them, in case it's helpful. I've also supported in family violence cases that have an impact on the broader Vietnamese community. In 2019, there were 2 tragic murder-suicides involving Vietnamese families. And because the perpetrators in these cases had killed themselves, there was no case for our office to prosecute, and DAs typically wouldn't be involved in cases. But in this case, I put on a victim advocate hat, and I helped the families liaise with our office's victim services unit because at the time we didn't have a victim speaking advocate, and we really wanted to make sure that these families of these really tragic incidents didn't fall through the cracks. We do now have a Vietnamese speaking advocate, Thao Huang, and she's fantastic, but at the time I put on that hat to work with the family, working with them to apply for CalVCB reimbursement to cover medical expenses, connect them with counseling resources, connecting one of the families with Bay Area Legal Aid to help maintain their housing, help them liaise with the coroner and San Jose PD, to collect some of their family members' belongings back after these incidents. And because of the media coverage of these incidents, we knew there would be broad community impact and vicarious trauma. So San Jose PD held an event at the Vietnamese American Cultural Center to convene mental health and DV resources for the Vietnamese community at this event in 2019. Some of the other panelists who spoke included behavioral health, mobile mental health team, as well as suicide prevention services, as well as the YWCA crisis intervention team, in addition to San Jose PD and myself, sharing some information about our victim services. So in addition to participating, I supported behind the scenes to outreach in a more asset-focused way, focusing on healthy relationships and strong families and connecting them with additional speakers and resources. I wanted to share some of the challenges I've experienced and observed in doing this work to address family violence within the Vietnamese community. First are the generational differences. I am a second-generation Vietnamese American, and I was educated and exposed to very different norms about healthy relationships and mental health and family violence through school, through work, than some older or first-generation immigrants, including my parents, where these topics are not discussed. 2 examples come to mind from the work that I just shared with you. With our I Dare to Air traveling clothesline exhibit, I had a community member, an older first-generation community member, reach out to me he reacted very negatively to the exhibit, saying that it highlights the existence of DV in the Vietnamese community, and he was afraid it would reflect poorly on the community. He was really upset at me for basically highlighting what he thought was a negative mark, for the community, right? And then for the radio outreach, right? When we went on to do the show, the radio host, Ji Ha Bang, said that in her experience doing radio outreach, the community would call in for many different topics to engage with the host or the speaker, but that every time we did a DV show, we didn't have anyone calling in, and it was true when we were there. And as much as I and my partners want to engage, some people in the community may not feel comfortable or ready to engage yet, and they may in fact be very resistant and hostile to even broach this topic. The second point I wanted to highlight was, or is, how difficult it is to replicate successes. You know, we know with the Promotores program, it's worked for Next Door Solutions and Community Solutions, and they've done a really great job with their programs. And what Aki and ICANN and myself, what we're in the midst of trying to strategize and brainstorm is, how do we create a program that's specific to the Vietnamese community, to the Vietnamese community, right? When there's different assets and different norms. It's, of course, it's realizing that a program like that, a Promotores program like that, will have to be community and culturally specific. The third point I wanted to highlight is interconnected systems and how we all have differing approaches. So there's so many systems, and we're all so connected, and we all touch upon these families' lives, right? The families that we serve, whether it's schools, community-based organizations, family resource centers, DV service providers, healthcare providers, law enforcement, right? And each one of these entities plays such an important role in preventing and addressing family violence. But we can have such different approaches, priorities, and use different language. An example that I'll talk about that I've come across is our approach is based on assets versus deficits. So we in law enforcement deal in the world of crimes when things go wrong, right? So we are steeped in this world of problems and needs. So for me, coming into it was like, how do we reduce family violence? Whereas our prevention and intervention partners have shifted to a more asset-based model. So for example, how do we promote healthy relationships or strengthen family bonds? So there's this need to shift as we are working with partners throughout the pipeline to speak in a language and to approach the issue in a way that makes sense to each partner. And sometimes that can be very hard. And I've seen partners not engage because it seems like our approaches don't align. So where do we go from here? So I want to share my thoughts from my experience working with our local Vietnamese community about where I think we go from here to achieve progress in a meaningful and sustainable way to promote healthy relationships and to address family violence within our communities. So first is early support and reinforcement of what a healthy and safe relationship looks like. And that's talking to kids when they are very young in a very age-appropriate way about what that means. And unfortunately, some children don't have that grown-up support at home. And schools typically, although not during the time of COVID, you know, we hope is the great equalizer when they're in that classroom, right? So supporting that public health education about healthy and safe relationships at schools, and children will soak it up and bring it home. And for me, where I've seen it, right, it's when our crime prevention unit or when our teams go into schools and talk about anti-bullying and things like that. And incorporating some of this language into those presentations, I think, will make a difference. The second point is multi-partner collaboration and support for the community. And I know it's a mouthful of buzzwords, but I think the picture that I have on the PowerPoint illustrates to me what that means. And this is a picture from the launch of I Dare to Air, the prevention campaign. And at this event, and even in putting together the exhibit, we had the collaboration of partners across so many sectors. At this event, we had a survivor speak. We had speakers and collaboration from DV service providers, from ACCI, from MyTree, from Community Solutions. You know, First Five was there, the Office of Women's Policy, the Peace Partnership, and law enforcement, right? And so, you know, we all came together to work towards a shared goal of reducing family violence. So, so it's leveraging each of our different strengths and resources and perspectives. And that sometimes means leading, or sometimes doing things behind the scenes, or, you know, it might mean like a partnership, or it might mean elevating the voices of our community, depending on the context. you know, and I know I included a bunch of logos in my PowerPoint, but I wanted to be very intentional about that and give credit to everyone, right? Because none of us can do this work alone, and we can't move the needle alone, right? And I think the important thing is to be open to working and partnering with agencies throughout the pipeline towards this shared goal of reducing family violence. And the last point I want to end on is two-way street. Now, what does that mean? So sometimes we agencies, and I'll include myself in it, right? We approach an issue like this. There's underreporting of DV in the Asian community or the Vietnamese community, and say, why aren't you reporting DV more? Why aren't you getting help, right? But I think like one of the most important things that we can do is to turn that mirror on ourselves and say, what practices do we have in place that makes it so that survivors and community members don't want to report DV? You know, why don't they have that trust? Like, what can we do better, right? And we know all of our systems can do better to serve the community and to be more culturally responsive, right? You know, I invite all of us to look within, but also reach out to partners throughout the pipeline to help us imagine and reimagine how we can all do better, how we can implement changes in our system so that we can be, so that we can more appropriately support our communities. Right? And while change can be slow to occur, change won't occur unless we're willing to speak up and have this dialogue outside of our silos. So that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Hani. I really appreciate all the efforts that you're making and all the partnerships that you're forging. I know we have some questions that have been posted in the Q&A. So I just, and we're gonna start with answering those. But if anybody who's listening has additional questions or questions that they think of while we're answering other questions, please let us know. Carla, how do you want us to do the Q&A?
Hi there. Well, Julie and I can put the questions out for both of you to see which one you'd like to take, if that's okay with you.
Sounds great.
Okay, so there's a couple questions around whether or not there might be some similar efforts within the Latino community, and asking if there are, what they are, and if there is a district attorney community prosecutor for Latinos.
Well, I'm going to say a few things, then I'm going to turn it over to Hani, who knows all about the efforts of community prosecutors. But I'll say that a lot of the work that we've done historically in the DA's office for outreach has been to the Latino community and to the white Caucasian community. And the reason why we're highlighting this today is because this is something that I think has been a neglected part of our outreach. That's something that we're trying to do that we are acknowledging we haven't done well before, and trying to specifically address the dramatic underreporting of domestic violence in our Asian communities. But Hani, why don't you tell a little bit about what your colleagues in community prosecution do in other parts of the county and why we're focused there?
Sounds good. So there's a total of 6 of us, including our supervisor, Chris Arrow. So we're a team, and we're assigned to the areas in our county that have the highest rates of juvenile crime. So it's very intentional. We have 3, at this point, I think 3 DAs that are based in San Jose. One of them, Terry McLaughlin, is based in East San Jose. But I also want to call out our DA, Hugo Mesa, who is Spanish speaking. And he is one of our Spanish-speaking community prosecutors. And so one of the things we do is we work in schools, work with school districts to work with families where their students are struggling with attendance, right? And we know when in these families where they're struggling with attendance, there's a whole host of other issues and needs. So one of the things that we want to make sure that we do is to connect them along with the school districts to services that will address some of these issues, whether it's mental health issues or family violence issues that make it hard for these families to get the students to school. So we do address it in that way. I also want to highlight also the work of our Spanish-speaking victim advocates. We have a really robust victim services unit, and they've accompanied me, the Spanish-speaking victim advocates, to many community events. So I know I highlighted the ones specific to the Vietnamese community, but they've accompanied me to some events where we've targeted Spanish-speaking families as well.
Thank you, Hani. I have another question for you from the Q&A section. It's regarding your Dare to Air campaign, and they're wondering how you measure your effectiveness of this campaign.
Well, I think it's anecdotal, right? And I think it's hearing that feedback from the agencies that host the exhibit and the ones that are willing to host the exhibit. And we've gotten support, I think, from the agencies that I noted, right? And so hearing their feedback, the employees there, and what they say in terms of the feedback that they hear from the community members that visit their space, who say that the feedback has been really good, and it's important to highlight that issue. I think that's one way that we can sort of measure, and I know it's sort of not numbers, but one way that we can measure the reach of the project. And I hope once we spin out the sort of peacemaker aspect of the campaign, right, where we're trying to rally community members to be a peacemaker in their communities, that we can measure in that way, right? Like in terms of a community member who sees the exhibit in a certain location, and if they then reach out to us to say, hey, I want to sign up, I want to pledge to be a peacemaker. So I hope then, once we have that aspect of it, that we can measure it in that way.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, a lot of the numbers that I showed you, all the numbers I showed you were 2018 and 2019 numbers, which are really around the time when this was just getting started. So one of the things, I'll say a couple things that we're hoping to see from this combined outreach of the I Dare to Air campaign, the radio promotions, all of the community outreaches, that if it results in more victim engagement with our nonprofit partners, if it results in more victims connecting with new promotoras that are being launched, and if it results in a higher rate of reporting of domestic violence crimes within the Vietnamese community, if we see that over the next couple of years, then I think that we'll have considered this a success. But I think that the main thing that I'm happy for right now is that we're not throwing up our hands and saying there's nothing we can do about these numbers that we're looking at. Well, one of these issues is an underreporting in our Asian communities. One of our largest Asian communities is our Vietnamese community. What can we do to address that specifically? So I'm proud of the effort, and I'm hoping it sees tangible results in the ways Hani mentioned, and also in the numbers that if I was going to do this 5 years from now, hopefully it would be different numbers that you'd have to see.
Thank you. Carla?
Thanks so much for that. So there's a question, and I'm wondering if there are any informational workshops available for parents now. I'm thinking this might mean now, because of COVID, we're not doing in-person things, but are there any workshops for parents that you have going on?
Do you want to talk about the Parent Project a little bit, Hani, which I know is doing things online, and people may not know what the Parent Project is?
I was going to mention as well, the Parent Project is this program that our office has that provides parents with tools to help deal with their strong-willed kids. And it's a 12-week program, and usually they're done in person in these little pods, whether at schools or at different community locations. But because of COVID, they've all shifted online through Zoom. So that's a fantastic program to provide tools for parents to help build that healthier relationship within the families. They're offered in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese as well. So that is something that is going on right now. If you're referring specifically to Vietnamese program for parents, I understand ICANN, the nonprofit that I mentioned, is having virtual programs. So you can refer folks who are interested to them as well.
Thank you. I've got another question for you. And just for a time check, we've got about 10 minutes left and 3 questions. Can you talk a little bit more on the differences between CPO violations and restraining orders from the family court violations, James?
Yeah, if you were to violate a family court restraining order or a criminal court restraining order, that itself is a crime. So there's a crime of violating a court order, and whether that court order is a family court restraining order or a criminal court restraining order, that's still a crime. The way we file those charges in criminal court, we make a distinction which allows us to track actually how many of the crimes we're filing are family court restraining order violations and how many are criminal court restraining order violations. And the reason why I showed that those 2 pie charts side by side was to highlight something that we had seen pretty consistently across all the other charts, was that 2 to 3% of the victims were from our Vietnamese community, 2 to 3% of the defendants for various crimes were from our Vietnamese community. But when we looked at the specific crime of violating a family court restraining order, that number went to near 0. And so the reason why I highlighted that was because I think that shows that while we file the crime of violating a family court restraining order, that this under engagement or under reporting is especially pronounced in family court restraining orders. And I think that it's something, as we look to what can we do to make the work that we're all doing better, is to think about that access to the family courts. And Hani mentioned that is that it has not always been the case that the family court forms have been easily available in Vietnamese, for example.
And just a follow-up related question. Sorry to interrupt, Carla, but somebody wants to know if do you have the divorce forms in Vietnamese?
I don't know the answer to that one. Do you know it, Hani?
So that's the forms that I had mentioned earlier, and it's through the state, I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's the state judicial website where they house all those forms. There's a couple years ago when this came up with the Vietnamese nonprofit I mentioned, they sent me a hidden link, so you couldn't even search for it. But I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to find it. And Carla and Julie, I'm happy to send it to you so that you can distribute it to this person who wants to know, so that they can pass it along.
I think it would be great to post with the conference materials. So why don't we plan on giving some links in addition to the PowerPoint with the conference materials. That would be great.
Yes, and I had a commissioner just share a link with me so I can provide that on our website along with other information. I'll turn it over to Carla right now.
Sure. Thank you. And so we have a few questions around strangulation, and wondering how the DA's office approaches the prosecution, if these are the types of charges that are diverted, or how often they're filed. And the person posing the question is saying that they seem very concerned because they understand how very serious and potentially lethal, and the fear of disclosure and cultural racial factors can also contribute to not disclosing some of these very serious crimes.
Yeah, I first want to start with, while we have a variety of diversion programs in the DA's office, we do not do diversion for domestic violence crimes. So when I showed the chart, for example, of the program to not file low-level drug offenses unless someone had had 3 in a year, we have nothing like that in domestic violence. So we don't have diversion programs in domestic violence. But about strangulation in particular, so first of all, this conference is having a great strangulation portion of it near the end. So if you haven't signed up for it, please consider doing that. We've seen a dramatic increase in strangulation cases, and I think it has to do with the training that we've been doing in our county for law enforcement, for prosecutors, for DV agencies around strangulation, that has taken something that was also underreported and making it more clear. And I think there's also been, I know there's been a change of philosophy about strangulation in the DA's office as a result of those trainings and a result of the research around strangulation. So 10 years ago, if we had a case where a woman said that she was choked out and blacked out, and there was no injuries visible on her neck when the police arrived, that we would typically issue that as a misdemeanor case. And more often now we're issuing that as a felony case because we hear that and know that what she means is that she was strangled to the point of unconsciousness and that she's got injuries, internal injuries, and other kinds of injuries that are very serious because strangulation is very serious, especially in cases that are so extreme that result in a loss of consciousness. The other thing we're doing is we're working with the Office of Gender-Based Violence and the Sheriff's Office, the San Jose Police Department, Santa Clara PD, and Gilroy Police Department on a pilot this year to have forensic medical examinations for DV strangulation victims. And I forgot to mention Community Solutions is a part of this as well as the why. So I wanted to mention that pilot program so we could talk a little bit about how we can improve what we're doing here in the county. And I think that getting those medical exams is a crucial part of properly diagnosing those injuries so that victims of strangulation can get the right treatment, but also properly documenting those injuries so that we can be effective in court in prosecuting them. So the short answer to your question is that we're filing more strangulation cases, we're filing them as more serious charges, and we're working with Valley Medical Center and the Office of Gender-Based Violence to better document those so we can prove them better in court.
Thank you. I think we can squeeze in another question. What can we advise clients to do when responding officers won't file restraining order violations when abusers leave the scene?
I think that the restraining order violations are some of the toughest cases for law enforcement, for victims, for our nonprofit community, for the courts, for the DA's office, everyone, because what we want our law enforcement partners to do is to write a police report in that situation and submit it to the DA's office so that we can review it to consider the filing of criminal charges. And we file, as I showed in those early slides, we file criminal restraining order and family court restraining order violations all the time. But we don't file them 100% of the time. And part of that has to do with making sure that we can convince a jury that there's been a crime that should be resulting in a criminal conviction. And I'll say that our jurors are further along with this than they were 10 years ago, and not far enough along as what I would want, because unless there is a violation that involved some kind of physical contact or repeated harassment or something that is not otherwise explainable, while our juries will convict in restraining order violations, it's just not as it's not as much as we want. And we need to do a better job in the DA's office of showing our jurors how important that is so that we win those cases more often and that we can therefore file them more often because we know that we're going to be able to prove them beyond a reasonable doubt.
Thank you. Carla, do you want to take another, ask another question?
Let's see. We're going to squeeze as much as we can into this. Absolutely. So people love the I Dare to Err campaign. It's amazing. Someone is noting that the majority of IPV victims are female, but there are victims who are male and non-binary identifying. Have you thought about incorporating stories from these groups into the campaign?
You know, we, at least for the initial iteration, we were focused, I think, on initially just highlighting the stories from, you know, these women from these communities, but we, I think, would love to have, I think, additional closed-on exhibits, and we had talked about that, to highlight, I think, stories from our diverse communities, right? And that would include, I think, men as well. So we hope in the future that we could do so.
Yeah, I think that you're also highlighting a really important issue for our whole community. I think that we can do a much better job of reaching out to our trans community, our gender non-binary community, and to be thinking more broadly about what it means to do outreach and what crimes of power and control, which these intimate partner violence cases are, how they can reach across all communities, and I think you highlight a really important point.
Thank you, and that's right on the dot. We're at 3:30. This has been very informative, and we're so grateful to have such experience and leadership in our county. We've had well over 100 participants, close to 150 in this workshop, so you had a great big impact there. I want to share with the participants that you will be receiving a link. It's an evaluation link, but along with that, it'll be some information to our website, the website of the Office of the Gender-Based Violence Prevention, where we will be posting the PowerPoints for you. Several folks asked about the PowerPoint, so they will be posted on our website. Please look for that link with more information. And we want to thank you again, presenters, for being with us. And that's a wrap. Appreciate it.